Welcome to Amadeus SCA's webinar on strong customer authentication in travel. I am Jean-Christophe Lecour, Head of Merchant Services at Amadeus Payment, and here with me today is Marianne Baylis, Director of Fraud Solutions for CyberSource. Now, a couple of housekeeping points before we get started. First of all, if you have any questions, you can submit them through the Q&A box that should be at the bottom right of your screen. Don't worry if we don't have time to cover all your questions. We'll follow up with you afterwards. You will have access to this presentation and other relevant material in the resources section of the webinar. Of course, feel free to share this webinar with your colleagues and contacts using the social media and email icons at the bottom of the screen. And finally, at the end of the webinar, there will be a short pop-up survey that we would love you to fill in and to give us some feedback. So please stay right until the end. Now we have lots to cover, so let's get started. So today we will cover, first of all, an overview of the regulation. So Marianne will give us an overview of that. We will then look at how the 3D Secure protocol has evolved in order to cater for the regulation and other things other than the regulation. We will then look at the impact on travel merchants. And finally, we will have an overview of the Amadeus 2 travel solution that we have developed together with CyberSource to serve the travel merchant sector.
Hello, so thank you, JC. So today I'm going to talk about PSD2 and strong customer authentication. And I'll talk about a little bit around exemptions and outer scope a little bit later on. But what is PSD2 and strong customer authentication? Well, it's a payment service directive that's been around for a number of years, and it's fair to say over the last 10 or so years, a lot has changed within payments, certainly the way in which we transact and where we pay and how we pay. So the PSD2 was looking to really provide support for those new payment items. Strong customer authentication is part of the PSD2 regulation, and it's been introduced to increase consumer protection online, reduce fraud, increase consumer confidence. At a very high level, what strong customer authentication is authentication required for all transactions over €30, date starting the 14th of September this year. So every transaction over €30 would now require strong customer authentication. There are some exemptions and there are some out of scope. There's also the cumulative rule, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But essentially, from the 14th of September, you'll need to support authentication or you may see transactions declined. So what is strong customer authentication? Well, SCA requires you to present, or the payer to present, 2 out of the following items. It will either be something the payer is, so maybe fingerprint, voice biometric, etc. It may be something the payer has, so pre-registered mobile device. And finally, something the payer knows, so a PIN or a static password. So 2 out of those 3 elements are required to meet strong customer authentication. So we talked about strong customer authentication, and I said that there were some items that were out of scope. So there are 3 key elements that are out of scope for strong customer authentication. First one, merchant-initiated transactions. So this is where, when the transaction is processed, I, as a customer, I'm just not there at that point. So it can be things like a regular subscription. It may be a bar. I've had a drink out of the minibar the night before, and I'm paying for that as I leave the hotel. So merchant-initiated transactions are out of scope for SCA. We also then have mail order or telephone order, or MOTO. So MOTO transactions at the moment today would be out of scope for strong customer authentication. We then have one leg out. So essentially the regulation requires me, if I'm using my EU issued card and the acquiring activity is taking place in the EU, then that transaction would be in scope for strong customer authentication. So if one of those things is not true, i.e. I might be using a US issued card, for example, then that would be one leg out and out of scope for strong customer authentication. Then we have exemptions to strong customer authentication. There's 4 key exemptions. The first one being low value, and I said right at the beginning that transactions over €30 will be required to authenticate. However, there will be some low value transactions that may also require authentication, and this is as a result of the cumulative rule. So, for example, if I'm shopping online and I may be shopping across multiple merchants, as soon as I trigger my 5th transaction low value, so I have a €25, a 28, a 25, a 29, as soon as I trigger that 5th transaction or I reach €100, then the cumulative rule will trigger and the issuer will want to authenticate. So at most, low value transactions are exempt, but there will be some that are in scope. Then we have a low risk exemption. So low risk exemption could be where the issuer deems the transaction low risk and wants to avoid the step-up authentication. They can apply the exemption. Acquirers can also apply a low risk exemption. Now, there are rules to when this can take place. First and foremost, both acquirer and issuer who want to apply exemptions will need to maintain specific fraud rate exemption percentages. So, for example, if they want to apply an exemption on a transaction up to €100, then their overall fraud rate must be 13 basis points or less. Up to €500, their overall fraud rate would be 1 basis point or less. So the maximum that a low-risk exemption can be applied is on a transaction up to the value of €500. Thirdly, we have trusted listing exemption. So as a consumer, I may shop regularly with a merchant and I may want to add them to my trusted list. It's expected that issuers will support a trusted solution. So I would be able to opt or exempt a merchant from strong customer authentication by adding them to my trusted list. And then finally, we have secure corporate payment. So there is an exemption for secure corporate payments, primarily for lodged cards. So if a card is lodged with a travel agent, for example, and only used for that type of transaction, then it could be or may be exempt from strong customer authentication. So, JC, what does it mean for the payments industry? So I'm going to talk about 3DS now, and I'm going to talk about the Authentication Protocol that is generally going to be used to provide authentication solutions. So 3DS is not new. It's been around since 2001. And it's fair to say there's been some challenges with the 3DS protocol in terms of, particularly if we're trying to shop on a mobile channel, from a customer experience point of view. So the protocol has evolved hugely over the last couple of years. From a user experience point of view, we now have a protocol that supports mostly friction-free. If we didn't have the regulation in place, actually with the new enhanced protocol, most transactions would benefit from a friction-free experience. Biometric authentication is supported. And the key one for me is removing activation during shopping. So for those of you that have experienced that pop-up request to put in a password and your date of birth and so on, it can be frustrating. So the new protocol has removed that. Then we have universal device, and I said that if you're trying to check out on mobile, 3DS 1.0 protocol can be a challenge, and the new protocol is mobile. It's device agnostic, so it works well, whether it's your laptop, whether it's your desktop, whether it's your mobile device. Thirdly, we then have the greater data sharing element. And when I talked about the low risk exemption, additional data is really important for an issuer to start making risk-based decisions. But within the 1.0 protocol, you could share around about 8 data fields. 2.0 protocol allows you to share 130 plus. So that extra data that we're sharing with an issuer becomes really important in terms of exemptions. And finally, it is regulatory smart. So it does support compliance, and it does allow for dynamic linking. It allows for the transaction risk analysis exemption, as I mentioned, and it will support new services as they come through. But as I said, 3DS has been around for 18 years, and it's been the 1.0 protocol. And for all of the reasons that I've just mentioned, that there really was a requirement to enhance that protocol. So we actually had 3DS 2.0 released around about 18 months ago with all of the features that I've just mentioned. But actually today as an industry, we're already on protocol 2.1. So the 2.1 protocol has all of the benefits from a user experience point of view, device agnostic, the greater sharing, but it also is looking to support a no step-up request. So within the 2.1 protocol, there is the opportunity to ask for no step-up. You're not asking for an exemption, you're purely asking for no step-up. So that's available today, and that's the protocol that CyberSource is on today. But we already know that 2.2 is around the corner. So we've been static on 1.0 for 17, 18 years, and today we know that 2.2 is just around the corner. Possibly available maybe September, October later this year. But 2.2 has all the benefits of 2.1, but now we're introducing the concept of exemption flags. So those 4 key exemptions that I mentioned, within the 2.2 protocol, we can now start requesting exemptions specifically by including an exemption flag. So that becomes really important for clients or merchants that really want to leverage exemptions and try and avoid step-up authentication. So as I say, 2.2 is around the corner, but we are already hearing of 2.3. So I think this is a really exciting time for authentication solutions because the protocol is evolving at a pace that I've certainly not seen in my time in payments.
Can I ask you a question now? I know we have some questions later on, but would you recommend that merchants wait until 2.3?
Oh, no, definitely not. I would recommend to look to 2.1, which is available today, in readiness for the regulation. A lot of the heavy lifting and the work that you need to do for 2.1 will need to be done anyway, whether you wait for 2.2 or wait for 2.3. The move from 2.1 to 2.2 should be very minimal.
Right.
Haven't seen the specs yet, but we're expecting it to be minimal. So the recommendation is absolutely move to 2.1, don't wait.
Don't wait, okay, brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. So what does that mean for the travel industry? First of all, I just want to talk about a few use cases or scenarios that we have. 3 main scenarios. The first one is where the traveler is going to purchase something directly from the travel supplier's website, an airline, for example, for a ticket, or a car rental, or a hotel room. In that case, the retailer has to apply strong customer authentication as with any other retailer using exactly the same rules as Marianne explained in the regulation. So that applies to any retailer in direct sales. Now, in the travel, obviously, indirect is also a prevalent scenario. And here, I guess we have 2 subsets. The first one, where the travel agent is the merchant of record. And in that case, the regulation applies to the travel agent as the merchant of record as it would to the travel supplier in the other case. And probably the more complex one, which is where the travel agent is not the merchant of record, but the travel supplier is the merchant of record. In that case, the travel agent still has to perform the authentication of the traveler on behalf of the travel supplier, even though they are not the merchant of record. So that's quite a change compared to what we've seen previously. Now, this is just an illustration. I've taken an airline because Amadeus is working with a lot of airlines. This could be a typical setup where an airline could be using an Amadeus booking engine and you have a varieties on the screen, or they could be using other booking engines, or they could just be using a payment page, or they could be, as we know, more complex scenarios. So for example, an airline may want to resell an insurance to a traveler at the point of purchase. And in that sense, the airline could be acting as an agent on behalf of the insurance provider. So these are some of the examples that we find, practically in the airline industry. And these are some of the examples that SCA will have to cope with, even though it was not necessarily intended that way right at the beginning or thought about right at the beginning. So here I'm really focusing more on the indirect or the distribution channel, where there are other parties playing a very important role. First of all, the GDS, so Amadeus as a GDS or other GDS providers. Essentially, they have to build the capability to pass on authentication data received from the travel agent and to send that together with the authorization to the payment schemes, as we have direct connectivity to the payment schemes. We must then be able to report that information to the BSP. The BSP itself needs to be able to extract that authentication data and be able to pass it on to the airline or to the acquirer of the airline. The travel agent, as we said before, needs to be able to cater for different use cases. We talked about an OTA, for example, where the traveler goes on a website, or there could be a TMC with a lodge card. These are different use cases, and the travel agent will have to apply authentication appropriately, obviously trying to make the most of the exemptions that Marianne highlighted earlier on. And finally, the acquirer plays the usual role, where once they have received the authentication request, they will request the clearing of that transaction using the normal channel. So just to really clarify again what happens on the indirect side, on the indirect sales, the typical transaction would be that a traveler. So here I'm using the example of an online travel agent, an OTA, rather than a TMC with a lodge card. The traveler would go to a website, would make a purchase, would enter their credit card details, for example, as a payment method. The travel agent would authenticate that traveler. Again, if we're talking about two-leg transactions, intra-European or intra-EEA, the cardholder would follow the process, would get authenticated, and if in that particular transaction the travel supplier was the merchant of record, the travel agent would then pass that authentication data onto the GDS, which would then send it through the payment schemes in the authorization. After that, the 3S data will be reported to the BSP or to ARC in the US. Sorry. So here what we've tried to do is not necessarily be exhaustive, but we've tried to list some of the complexities or the real way that business is done in the travel industry, and what can be done with the current protocol, 3S 1.0 or 2.0, which is available now, and what could be done later on with 2.2, which, as Marianne said, is coming soon near us. Multi-merchant payment, so this would be typical, for example, of someone buying a package holiday that would be comprised of a flight, of a car rental, of a hotel room, and the travel agent would then need to reimburse each of the travel supplier separately. Now, this is quite a complex use case. At the moment, the same 3DS data would be used for each of those multiple authentications, and in the future we would be able to leverage a new channel, 3RI, in order to basically have a specific CAVV, the cryptogram for the authentication, for each of the authorization for each of the separate purchases. So it's quite significant. To be able to reuse the same at the moment is okay, but moving forward people will want to see an authentication specific to their request. Delayed authorization, again, in the travel industry, it's very usual for people to reserve something and for that transaction to not materialize until a few months later. At the moment, the 3DS results is valid for about 3 months, but obviously that doesn't cater for all use cases. So the idea would be that with the new 2.2 protocol, leveraging 3RI, we would be able to extend the validity of the cryptogram of the CAVV and therefore better catering for the real use cases in the travel industry.
You could, on that one, there's also the option to use MIT or merchant-initiated exemption. So if within the MIT framework, there is a delayed authorization flag, so that's an option as well.
Okay, thank you. MIT, so here we would be looking at, so as Miriam explained, they are exempted or they are really out of scope,
yeah.
rather than exempted. However, the first time that you create the transaction, you have to authenticate. And if you were going to change the amount of the transaction moving forward, you would need to authenticate again. So this would happen regardless of the protocol. And what would matter is to be able to store the transaction ID at the time when the account verification is being done. Card on file. So this is, I would say, a fairly straightforward use case. So here we would perform an authentication followed by an account verification. I would say straightforward as is today. Then we have a number of other use cases. We've talked about transaction risk analysis, which again are very, I would say, exciting for merchants because they have the potential of reducing the amount of times that two-factor authentication has to be applied to a transaction. We have low-value transactions. We have the secure corporate payment exemption, which again will be vital for TMCs, lodge cards, and other use cases. And then we have the whitelisting. So at the moment, it's only possible to do that within the authorization message. And we need to ensure that the issuer community is really on board for that to work very well. And what we're saying is that with the new protocol or the later version, 2.2, then we'll be able to do that within the authentication itself rather than just the authorization. So again, that makes a huge difference. And I think in reality, each of those protocols is bringing something new. 1.0 today, although it's not perfect, has the merit of working. It's being used in many places. We're encouraging merchants to try 2.0, which is available now. And then there will be enhancements. The issuer community will start responding to how it's being used, and everybody will benefit. The end game, I suppose, being to maintain a very low fraud level in the system, as well as minimizing any friction on the traveler.
Absolutely. From a client's point of view, whilst issuers and acquirers are going to manage exemptions, they will be looking to see that you've maintained fraud rates that are within those guidelines, so that they can do that. And then finally, and you made a really good point, I think exemptions as a whole are going to evolve over the next few months. So whilst 2.2 supports exemption flags, actually issuers reacting and supporting exemptions, I think will evolve over time. So quite an exciting time.
It's an organic development is what we're saying. Obviously, we have focused here more on airlines, which today is the core set of customers from an Amadeus payment standpoint. But obviously, Amadeus, for example, caters also for a lot of other travel verticals, listed on that particular slide. So we are working with stakeholders in each of those other travel verticals in order to, I would say, get the same level of understanding as we have achieved today with airlines and the distribution. And now I would say the final part of the presentation is an overview of 3DS2 Travel. So 3DS2 Travel is a solution that we have developed together. I'll explain what we've done specifically on that. So when it came to choosing a 2.0, 2.x solution, Amadeus had a number of options. We could have built it ourselves, which we have done before with 1.0. So today we have 30 plus airline customers using 1.0 built by us. And when it came to 2.0, we really thought long and hard about whether we should develop it ourselves or partner. And in the end, what we decided to do in order to really minimize the risk, bearing in mind that this regulation, is quite new, the protocol is quite new, we don't know exactly how it's going to evolve. So we decided that to minimize the risk on our side and on our customers as well, we would partner with a very reputable company in the business, CyberSource, And that would also give us a future-proof solution in the sense that they are the expert. They work with Cardinal Commerce, which is another Visa company. They understand authentication better than anybody else. And if they remain on top of their game, we as provider will automatically benefit from those enhancements. So that's really the reason why we were keen to do that. The other benefits of working with CyberSource and Cardinal Commerce is that as part of the Visa family, Visa is also on the access control server side of authentication, and they have a really good understanding of how issuers respond to authentication. So it's not just it's not just looking at the merchant side, it's being able to look at the merchant side as well as the issuer side, which we think also enhances the chance that authentication requests will be handled in a better way. So that's the reason why we were keen to work with CyberSource. In terms of the solution itself, there is a lot more documentation that exists and that will tell you all about the solution. The key points for me that are really relevant is on the right-hand side, you can see that all the payment schemes are automatically supported by this solution. So whether you're a Visa, MasterCard, JCB, UnionPay, your transaction will be supported, which is really important. So we don't need to spend time adding each of the payment schemes, going through certification, etc. You will see that we have a seamless 3DS 1.0 and 2.0 solution. And again, it is really important because although I think both of us would love to see every single merchant in the world on a 2.0 protocol, we're conscious that many merchants today use 1.0, and especially for those global merchants operating across multiple regions, we fully understand that they may want to retain 1.0 in some markets and then migrate to 2.0 in others. So it's very important that as a merchant, you have a solution that allows you to do that seamlessly, as opposed to basically having two separate implementations. And all solution gives you that. It's available via SDK, web services. So again, it can easily be integrated. We have on our side integrated it in the 4 main Amadeus front ends, which I showed earlier on one of the slides, and they're all being piloted. So if you're an existing Amadeus customer and you have one of those front ends, you can be reassured that it's already working, it's being tested, and it's being piloted as we speak. And the other point that was made around the amount of data, I think it's particularly relevant in the travel industry, where there is a lot of data related to that particular travel purchase, which will be very pertinent to help issuers make a better risk scoring of that transaction and give the more appropriate response to that authentication. And coming soon, so the headline really of that slide is really I would say it's almost the nirvana of authentication, if I can call it that way, where we have dynamic authentication that caters for all the use cases. If you're in a country without any regulation, then it will just focus on the friction, trying to reduce the number of active authentication of the consumer as much as possible, to focus on the conversion rate. If you are in a country or in a region with a regulation, like SCA in Europe, but we know that more and more there will be similar strong authentication regulations in India already, and probably in other countries in the world, then even in that situation, which in the past would have been really, really tough to manage, we really think that with the 2.2 protocol and the evolution of our solution, merchants will be in an ideal place to really make the best of both worlds. Control the security, and to be fair, even if there was no regulation, it's always been in everybody's interest to control security, to bring the fraud down, to protect the merchant, to protect their customers, and at the same time maximize your conversion rate, which is what every merchant are in business to do. So it's coming soon, probably by the end of the year, so in between the 14th of September and end of the year, and it's going to be really exciting. But I guess our key message would be, don't wait for that, get started, try the 2.0 protocol, try the solution, and then grow from there. Try several markets, test it, and grow from there.
I think being able to do to dynamically decide what you want to do with a transaction pre-authentication becomes really important with the evolving of exemptions in the future, and I think this is a great pathway to that kind of approach.
Cool. So we're both really excited at the prospect of this happening. We're still a few months away from it, but not that far ahead. And again, 14th of September is right around the corner. Make sure you are ready for 14th of September, either with a 1.0 solution or 2.0 solution, and then test it, play with it, work with it, and then evolve your solution to something that's really going to fit your particular business. So we'll take a break now, and we'll take some questions after the break.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne.
Thank you.
Okay, welcome back. We have received a few questions. We're just going to go through some of them and attempt to provide some responses to those. So the first question we've had is in relation to secure corporate payment exemptions. So the question is, does that mean that all corporate cards are out of scope of SCA? Marianne, would you like to attempt?
Yeah, so the corporate card exemption is primarily for lodge cards. So yours and I, corporate cards with our name on it, we would be expected to authenticate if we're using our card online as any other card.
Yep.
It really is focusing on those cards where it's just direct from travel portal to an airline, for example. It's lodged, it's secure, and therefore the exemption could be applied.
Okay.
So,
and maybe one more thing on that is that we understand that when those cards are used in distribution, at the moment there isn't an obvious flag between those systems and the GDS, for example, and that's something that certainly we will be working on with other GDSs and other stakeholders like IATA, but also key stakeholders in the hotel industry. What's going to be important is that we don't end up having one flag per travel vertical, so that providers will just need to make one update, and then they'll be able essentially to explain the context of that transaction, the fact that it's a lodge card, to carry the context through downstream. Today it will be done at authorization, and we hope that with this new development, which will take a while but which will be important, all those use cases will be, I would say, very accurately treated.
That's a really good point, actually, JC. So the exemptions are purely requests to exempt. So the issuer has the final say on whether an exemption is applied. So there is always a risk that if you're requesting an exemption in authorisation, the issuer may decline it for SCA. So I think exemptions and authorisation are great, just be aware of the risk, hence the reason why we're looking to develop further to ensure that exemptions are supported on authentication as well.
No, it's true, and we've been part of a number of travel industry specific forums where issuers have indeed said that we will get the exemption request, but we cannot take them at face value. So they will have also to do their own background research to understand the context of that transaction and then satisfy themselves that they can indeed apply and not decline. So we will see how it develops, but certainly this is just the beginning of a journey as we've explained. Another question we had was whether 3DS 1.0 is compliant.
It's a great question, actually. So 3DS 1.0 is compliant. There are a couple of things, or a few things to consider. The 1.0 protocol does not support exemptions. So we're moving to a protocol that will support exemptions, 1.0 does not. So the likelihood step-up authentication would take place more often than not. MasterCard have announced a sunset date as well, so they are sunsetting 1.0. Visa haven't yet announced that. And then the other thing, which we mentioned right at the beginning, was the experience from a mobile point of view. The 1.0 protocol is not great from an experience point of view, and actually some in-app payments just cannot work on a 1.0 protocol. So at a high level, 1.0 is compliant, but the recommendation is your 2.1 for all of those reasons.
Okay, and just maybe to add to that, certainly on our experience with some of our customers today is that they have 1.0. They will continue doing 1.0 in the short term. But as I said before, with the solution that we have, they will be able to do 1.0 in some cases and 2.0 in other cases. And we think in a way that's the best of both worlds. If you can migrate everything on time 14th September to the latest protocol, great. But we know that it's not necessarily the case for many merchants. So being able to do that is fantastic. So in other words, 1.0 is fine, but you're not going to get the best balance between security and friction, or lack of friction rather. Another question we've received was, what will happen if I don't integrate 3DS? What do you think will happen, Miriam?
At all.
At all.
So in theory, what should happen is the issuer, if they want to step the transaction up for authentication, so if they recognise that it's in scope, they will decline for SCA. Okay. So the risk is, if you're not supporting 3DS, that you will see some transactions decline if the issuer wants to do the authentication. And from the 14th of September, they are required to. So, you know, we would recommend you supporting 3DS. Okay.
I guess same on our side. We also recommend our merchants to engage with their acquirers, in addition to their payment service providers like ourselves, to get a better understanding of, you know, what will happen if they do or don't do certain things in their channels. So another one we had was whether meet and recurring are the same thing, or are they different things? What's your understanding?
There was, with the original regulatory technical standards, the exemption for recurring was referenced, but actually recurring and merchant initiated transactions are essentially the same. Right. So a recurring transaction can be, you know, a regular an amount, it's the same amount on a regular basis. So it might be a Netflix type subscription. That's a recurring. But because merchant initiated is out of scope, you would always use your merchant initiated and follow the framework. So recurring exists, but it's an MIT transaction, so use the out of scope. Okay,
brilliant. So we have clarity on this one. Another one, I think, which touches on a very important point, which is, so if an issuer is using their card with an issuer in the EU in another country, does strong customer authentication regulation apply?
Great question. So we go back to the one leg out scenario. Okay. So to be in scope for SCA, I'm using my EU issued card. I'm in the United Kingdom and with a UK merchant. That's in scope for SCA.
Okay.
But if I travel, for example, and I go to New York and I decide to shop online in New York, if the acquiring activity is taking place locally, then it would be one leg out and out of scope for SCA. So it's EEA countries, issued in the EEA, acquired in the EEA.
Okay, thank you. And then just to also complement, we've had similar requests specifically for travel agents, for distribution business, and it wasn't clear what would be the reference point in a transaction that is distributed at the point that a person engages with the travel agent. The travel agent or the GDS does not know the acquirer of the travel supplier at the back. So the question we've had is, how do we deal with this particular use case? And at the moment, what we understand is that the easiest way, and this is being validated by the schemes, Visa and MasterCard in particular, is to use the geography of the business of the travel agent as a proxy for that transaction, because anyway, we won't know who is the airline acquirer at that point in time. So we need to find something, but it was important to clarify that. So we will be issuing further clarification on that topic, but it's really important. Another thing that we're doing in addition to the solution is we will have, as part of the solution, something that will help merchants identify if their transactions are one leg or two leg. It's going to be really important for merchants who don't want to apply the same authentication uniformly. So they might say, if it's SCA, I will apply this, and if it's not, I will apply something else. So we will have that in the solution, again, available for September, before the 14th of September. And now, I guess the big one of all of the questions that we've seen, somebody is saying, I am hearing news that SCA is being delayed. What do you think?
That's a good question.
Is that true, Miriam?
Okay, what we can talk about is on the 21st of June, the European Banking Authority released a statement or an opinion. And it was really reacting to the general kind of view that as an industry, not everybody is ready. There may be some players that just aren't going to be ready by September. So what the EBA is saying at a very high level is, they are supporting a transition period or a sort of, it's not a change of the date, essentially. It's just saying, look, if you're not ready, speak to your local regulator, let them know why you're not ready, when you plan to be ready, and we'll allow a period of time for you to transit. So that was the EBA. The FCA have announced that they're not going to enforce the regulation. So that's for the UK on the 14th. So they are going to give people time to be ready. But of course, the key thing is, it's because the EBA are saying, look, this is down to your regulator or your local competent authority for each region. We really need to get harmony across all of those regions, because the FCA have made an announcement, but we need to understand what's happening everywhere. So if you're cross-border merchant, you may experience a different transition period. So we are recommended continue, certainly as merchants, be ready for September, because there will be, some transition, but it will not be the same everywhere. So, but there's more to follow, and as we get more information and more announcement come through, we will be sharing that. But that's the position today.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I mean, we've had similar conversations. People have said, so if for a two-leg transaction cross-border, the card is in a country where the regulator does not want to give an egress period, and then the merchant is in a country like the UK, for example, where the FCA have said that they will not enforce from day one, what does that mean? Does that mean that the issuer would be forced to decline because the retailer would not come with two-factor authentication? Obviously, so what we're saying again is that the message from the EBA, I think, has been expected for a while. There was a lot of noise building up to the 14th of September, and I think it will provide some relief, but it falls short of a uniform statement and it just delegates the problem to the local regulation authorities.
Yeah, that's how.
So we're back to kind of thanks, but it's not fully sorted.
Continue.
And I think now probably the majority of local authorities have declared what they plan to do. But again, you need to really read every single one of them to understand what's in it, what's the difference between each of them, and see whether there's a common path. But I think the next wave of noise now is uniformity.
Absolutely.
Because whilst it's great that the regulator, the EBA, has thought about grace period, which was being asked by the industry a lot, I think if there is no harmony, it almost defeats the objective.
I agree. And I think there is lobby. So the industry is lobbying for that harmonisation. But I think, reality is it's going to be difficult to get 100% harmony. So yes, I would agree with your comments, being ready, particularly if you cross border, it becomes actually really important.
Yeah.
The other thing to remember though as well is 3DS, particularly the 2.1 protocol and going forward, from a user experience point of view, is much better. It's a greatly improved protocol, and it adds that protection to you as a merchant for fraud. So parking the regulation, authenticated transactions we know have a greater authorization rate. So there are still other reasons outside of the regulation.
No, it's a really good point. I think this was focused on SCA, and obviously we've taken it as SCA. But in any case, what we're saying is that the 2.0 protocol is a huge enhancement on 1.0, and there will be further enhancement with 2.1, 2.2, and we're really encouraging merchants not to wait and not to just use the SCA grace period, if there is one, as an excuse to not do it. We think there are more benefits to try it now, play with it, even if you don't do it in all your markets. If you're a global merchant, try it in some markets, play with it, see what it gives you. And then at least you'll be in a much better place when the hard date really comes in, if it doesn't already come in on the 14th of September, which it may well do. So I think that's all we have time for question today. Thank you very much for watching. Please take the time to take the short survey. It's really important that we get feedback. And again, many thanks again to Marianne.
You're
Thanks
welcome.
for all your input and your expertise on this webinar.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.